Please, the general is waiting for me. The voice was soft, layered with the dry rustle of age, yet it carried with a strange clarity over the low hum of the security gate's electronics. Private Evans, barely 20 and filled with the unshakable certainty of a man in his first proper uniform, didn't even look up from his datapad. He gestured vaguely with a thumb towards the public waiting area, a sterile glass box set 50 yards away from the imposing checkpoint. You need to check in over there, ma'am. All civilian visitors, no exceptions. His partner, Sergeant Cole, leaned against the bulletproof kiosk, arms crossed. He had a few more years on Evans, which he'd converted directly into a thick shell of condescending authority. He let a slow, deliberate gaze travel over the old woman. She was small, wrapped in a simple beige coat that had seen too many winters. Her shoes were practical, sensible, and worn. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense bun. She looked like someone's grandmother, lost on her way to the post office. Cole exchanged a smirk with Evans. It was the third time this week they'd had a confused civilian wander up to the primary access point for command headquarters, a place where colonels sometimes had to wait for clearance. The woman didn't move. She held a worn leather purse in both hands, her knuckles slightly swollen with arthritis, but her grip was steady. She simply repeated her statement, her voice unchanged in tone or volume. The general is waiting for me. General Madsen. My appointment was for 1400. She looked at the chronometer on the wall, a large, intimidating red digital display. It read 1358. Her politeness was absolute, but there was an unnerving lack of pleading in it. She wasn't asking for a favor. She was stating a fact that they were obstructing. This subtle distinction was lost on Private Evans, but it registered as a flicker of annoyance for Sergeant Cole. He pushed himself off the kiosk and took a step towards her, adopting the patient, patronizing tone he reserved for difficult children and the elderly. Ma'am, I understand, but General Madsen is a very busy man. You can't just walk up to his front door. You go to the visitor center, they'll call his office, and if you really have an appointment, they'll send an escort. That's the procedure. He spoke the word procedure with a leaden finality, as if it were a law of physics. He expected her to sigh, perhaps grumble a bit, and then shuffle off towards the glass box of bureaucratic purgatory. Instead, she remained perfectly still. Her posture was the first thing that didn't quite fit. For a woman who looked to be in her late 70s, she stood with her shoulders squared and her back ramrod straight, a military brace that age had not managed to bend. Her feet were planted slightly apart, a balanced, centered stance that seemed entirely unconscious. And her eyes, they weren't the cloudy, uncertain eyes of someone lost. They were a pale, clear blue, and they weren't looking at Sergeant Cole so much as they were looking through him. They swept the perimeter in a series of short, economical movements, taking in the anti-vehicle barriers, the camera placements on the stanchions, the overlapping fields of fire from the guard towers. It was a scan, an assessment, as reflexive and natural to her as breathing. She was cataloging threats and exits without a single conscious thought. To Cole and Evans, she was just an old woman staring into space. They couldn't see the ghost of 1,000 other checkpoints, 1,000 other hostile borders, being superimposed over their pristine, orderly gate. Her silence began to feel less like confusion and more like a deliberate, weighty stillness. It was starting to get under Cole's skin. He was used to civilians who argued, who complained, who bristled at authority. He wasn't used to this quiet, immovable presence that somehow made him feel like he was the one being evaluated. Captain Davies was on his way out of the command complex, his mind a cluttered mess of logistics reports and personnel requisitions. The North Gate was the last hurdle between him and a quiet evening at home. He saw the holdup from 50 yards away, Cole and Evans, two of his more reliable, if overzealous gate guards, in a low-grade standoff with a civilian. His first instinct was annoyance. He didn't have time for this. He was about to tap his comms and tell Cole to clear the lane, but something made him pause. He slowed his stride, observing. It wasn't the guards who caught his attention, it was the old woman. From a distance, she was just a shape, but as he drew closer, he began to see the details, and the details were all wrong. It was a collection of tiny inconsistencies that, in isolation, meant nothing. But together, they began to paint a picture his training had taught him to recognize. He saw her posture, the rigid discipline in her spine that defied the gentle slope of her shoulders. He saw the way she held her purse, not dangling from her arm, but held in front of her with both hands. The way a soldier holds a rifle at port arms or an operator protects a sensitive equipment bag. It was a position of readiness, of control. Davies was a logistics officer, a man of numbers and supply chains, but he'd spent his mandatory years in the field. He'd served alongside men and women from every conceivable branch of the armed forces, including the shadowy ones that didn't put their insignia on their uniforms. He had learned to see beyond the surface, to read the language of bearing and movement. He watched as Sergeant Cole puffed out his chest and spoke down to the woman, his voice a low rumble of impatience. The woman's response was to do nothing at all. She just stood there, a small, gray rock in the stream of military procedure. Davies's focus sharpened. He noticed her hands, gnarled with age, yes, but the skin over the knuckles was a latticework of old scars, thin and white. They weren't the scars of kitchen accidents. They were the faded tracks of cuts and abrasions that spoke of a different kind of life. He changed his trajectory, walking towards the gate not as an officer in a hurry, but as an observer drawn to an anomaly. As he got closer, he could hear the dialogue, the tired condescension from his men and the quiet, unwavering insistence from the woman. He knew, with a sudden, prickling certainty that raised the hairs on his arms, that this was not a lost grandmother. This was something else entirely. "Sergeant Cole, is there a problem here?" Davies's voice was calm, cutting through the stagnant tension. Both guards snapped to attention, their casual arrogance evaporating in the presence of an officer. "Sir," Cole said, his back straightening, "this civilian is refusing to follow procedure. She's blocking the lane and insists she has an appointment with General Madsen. We've directed her to the visitor center." Davies nodded slowly, his eyes not on his men, but on the woman. She turned her head to look at him, and for the first time, he met her gaze directly. The pale blue eyes were like chips of ice, analytical and incredibly weary, as if they had seen far too much of the world. There was no fear in them, no anger, just a profound, bottomless patience. "Ma'am," Davies said, his tone respectful. "I'm Captain Davies. May I ask your name?" The question was for her, but the tone was a signal to his men. This is how you address someone. You start with respect. "Anya Petrova," she replied, her voice still soft. The name meant nothing to Davies. It was ordinary, Slavic. It offered no clue. "And you have an appointment with General Madsen?" he asked. "Yes, Captain. At 1400, she said, glancing at the clock again. 1402. I am now 2 minutes late." He dislikes tardiness. A faint smile touched her lips, a small, private thing. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of shared history, of knowing a man's habits intimately. This small detail sent another jolt through Davies. Civilians didn't talk about four-star generals like they were old friends who were persnickety about timekeeping. Private Evans, however, saw the captain's engagement as a sign that they were right to be firm. He stepped forward, eager to prove his diligence. "Sir, with all due respect, there's no appointment for any Petrova on the visitor log. I checked twice. She doesn't have the proper credentials to be in this lane." He was young, and he believed in the infallibility of his systems. If the computer said no, then the answer was no. The universe was that simple. Davies held up a hand to silence him, his gaze still locked on Anya Petrova. He looked more closely at her face. In the harsh sunlight, he could see a scar he'd missed from a distance. It was a thin, silvery line that ran from just below her earlobe and disappeared under her jaw. It was perfectly straight, a knife wound, old and long-healed. He had a similar one on his forearm from a training exercise gone wrong. His had been an accident. He had a strong feeling hers had not. The pieces were clicking together in his mind, forming a terrifying and unbelievable mosaic. The posture of a drill instructor, the situational awareness of a scout sniper, the hands of a combat engineer, the scar of an operative, the calm of a professional who had faced down men far more dangerous than two jumpy gate guards. Davies made a decision. He turned to Sergeant Cole. "Which General Madsen did she specify?" Cole blinked, confused by the question. "Sir, there's only 1 inch." Davies's voice was sharp. "There are two, Sergeant. There is Brigadier General David Madsen at Logistics Command, and there is General Eric Madsen, Commander of Joint Special Operations Command." Which one? The question hung in the air. Cole's face went blank. He hadn't even considered it. He looked at the old woman, who answered for him, her voice precise and clipped, a sudden shift from her softer tone. General Eric T. Madsen. Serial number 258-33-9174. JSOC. His office is on the 4th floor of the Citadel, northwest corner. She recited the information as if reading from a file she had memorized decades ago. A cold dread, heavy and real, began to pool in Sergeant Cole's stomach. Private Evans just looked bewildered. The serial number was not public information. The exact location of the JSOC Commander's office was classified. Private Evans, however, was a creature of protocol. His brain, unable to process the implications, defaulted to the rulebook. He saw a security breach in progress. He saw an unvetted civilian who possessed classified information. His training kicked in, overriding the subtle warnings his instincts were trying to send him. "Sir, she's not authorized to have that information," he said, his voice rising in alarm. "I think we need to detain her." He took a step towards Anya, reaching for her arm. It was the movement of a young man who believed his uniform gave him the right. He was about to touch the sleeve of her beige coat. He never made it. Anya didn't move in a way that looked fast, but the space between them was suddenly, impossibly, occupied. She shifted her weight onto the balls of her feet, a subtle pivot that dropped her center of gravity. Her left hand, the one that had been resting on her purse, came up in a smooth, fluid arc. It wasn't a strike. It was a placement. She laid her palm flat against his chest, her fingers spread over his sternum. Her touch was feather-light, yet it stopped his forward momentum completely, as if he'd walked into a steel beam. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer the soft voice of a grandmother. It was a low, resonant command, filled with an ancient and terrible authority. "I would not do that if I were you, Private." The transformation was absolute. The frail old woman was gone. In her place stood something else, something forged in a crucible that Evans and Cole could not even imagine. Her pale blue eyes now burned with a cold fire. The air around her seemed to thicken, charged with a palpable sense of danger. Private Evans froze, his hand hovering in midair. He could feel a faint tremor from her palm traveling through his chest, a subtle vibration that hinted at a coiled strength he couldn't comprehend. Sergeant Cole, who had seen real combat, recognized the shift immediately. He'd seen it in seasoned operators right before a breach. That sudden, total focus, the shedding of all extraneous identity until only the weapon remained. He felt a primal fear that had nothing to do with rank or procedure. He grabbed Evans by the shoulder and pulled him back hard. "Stand down, Evans. Stand down now." Captain Davies was already moving, his hand on his own comms unit, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew, with the kind of certainty that precedes a lightning strike, that they were standing on the edge of a career-ending and possibly life-ending mistake. He had to fix this, and he had to fix it 3 seconds ago. He keyed the channel not to the gatehouse, but to the direct line for General Madsen's aide, a notoriously unflappable major named Kendrick. "Major Kendrick, this is Captain Davies at the North Gate. Apologies for the direct contact." Davies' voice was steady, betraying none of the chaos unfolding in his mind. "I have a guest here for the General, a Mrs. Anya Petrova. She believes she had an appointment for 1400. He chose his words with surgical care. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. For a full 5 seconds, there was only static. Davies could hear the frantic, muffled sounds of a chair being pushed back, of someone moving very, very quickly. Then Kendrick's voice came on, and all the calm professionalism was gone. It was tight, strained, and laced with something that sounded like pure panic. "Captain, is she there right now? Is she unharmed?" "Unharmed," Davies thought. "We're the ones in danger." "Yes, Major. She's here. She is fine." Kendrick's next words came out in a rush. "Do not let her move. Do not let anyone else near her. The General is on his way down personally. I repeat, the General is en route to your location. Secure the lane and extend every possible courtesy. Davies, for the love of God, tell me your men didn't upset her." The line went dead. Davies lowered his hand, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He turned to look at Cole and Evans. They stood like statues, their faces pale masks of confusion and dawning horror. The authority had completely inverted. The two armed soldiers in body armor were now the supplicants, and the small old woman in the beige coat held all the power. Davies took a deep breath. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He walked over to his two men and spoke in a low, intense voice that was more terrifying than any parade ground bellow. You two have just failed the most important test of your careers. You looked, but you did not see. He gestured with his chin toward Anya, who had lowered her hand and resumed her patient, watchful stance as if nothing had happened. You saw a little old lady. You should have seen the way she stands. You should have seen her eyes. You should have felt the ground shake when she spoke to you. The guards stared at him, their mouths slightly agape. He leaned in closer. That name, Anya Petrova, it means nothing to you. It's not supposed to. Her entire service record is a black hole. It's classified so far above top secret that generals need special permission just to read the cover sheet. In the 80s, during the worst days of the Cold War, the KGB had a code name for an agent they could never catch, an operative who dismantled their networks from the inside out, right under their noses in East Berlin and Kiev. They called her Tseni, the Shadow. She recruited, trained, and ran the first generation of our most elite special activities operators. The men who wrote the book that you pretend to follow. She is a living legend, a ghost who walked out of the history books. And you too, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Just told her to go wait in the civilian line. As if on cue, a sleek, black command vehicle with darkened windows glided to a halt beside the kiosk. It didn't have flashing lights or a siren. It didn't need them. Its presence alone screamed authority. The rear door opened before the vehicle had fully stopped, and General Eric Madsen emerged. He was a tall, formidable man with a chest full of ribbons and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was a 4-star general who commanded the most lethal fighting force on the planet, a man whose quiet displeasure could end careers. He didn't even glance at Captain Davies or the two terrified guards. His eyes were only for Anya. The hard lines on his face softened. The iron authority in his shoulders seemed to melt away, replaced by a look of profound, almost reverent affection. He walked straight to her, his polished boots silent on the asphalt. "Anya," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You came. You should have called from the airport. I would have come to you." He took her small, scarred hands in his own. It was a gesture of immense tenderness, the powerful warrior deferring to his elder, his teacher. Anya gave him that same faint, knowing smile. "And missed the chance to see if your boys were paying attention? You've built a fine fortress, Eric. But your sentries need to learn to see the person, not the uniform." Her gaze flickered over to Cole and Evans, who both looked as if they were about to be physically ill. General Madsen's eyes followed hers, and the warmth in them instantly vanished, replaced by a glacier. His gaze fell upon the two young men, and they felt the full, crushing weight of a 4-star general's disapproval. It was an experience they would never forget. They flinched as if struck. But before the general could speak, Anya gently squeezed his hand. "They were diligent, Eric. They followed their procedures. They are good soldiers. A little green, perhaps, but they held their line. There is no fault here." Her words were a grant of absolution, a shield she effortlessly placed between the general's wrath and the two young men who had mocked her moments before. It was an act of incredible grace. Madsen held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He turned back to Anya, helping her with her simple coat as if it were a royal mantle. "Come," he said gently. "We have much to talk about. The new class of recruits is here. They would be honored to hear from you." He led her towards the command vehicle, his hand protectively on her arm. As he passed Captain Davies, he gave a short, sharp nod of gratitude. It was a small gesture, but from a man like Madsen, it was the equivalent of a medal. The black car pulled away, disappearing into the heart of the vast military complex, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence at the north gate. Captain Davies let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned to face Cole and Evans. They were still at rigid attention, their faces ashen. The swagger was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding humility that had been brutally hammered into them in the space of 10 minutes. Sergeant Cole was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. "Sir, He couldn't finish. There were no words. "What do we do now, sir?" Private Evans asked, his voice barely a whisper. Davies looked at the two of them, at their youth, their shock, their sudden, violent education. He didn't feel anger, only a strange sense of pity and responsibility. "You stand your post," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You finish your shift. And tomorrow, you do it again. But from this day forward, you do it with your eyes open. You remember what you saw here. You remember that honor and courage don't always wear a uniform. Sometimes they wear an old beige coat. You learn that the most important threats and the most valuable allies are the ones you don't see coming." He let the words sink in, then turned and walked away, leaving them alone with their new and heavy understanding of the world. Cole and Evans stood their post for the remaining 4 hours of their shift in absolute, unbroken silence, the weight of a legend's grace settling upon their shoulders.